I think it's so important to, no matter how much anxiety it might produce in the moment, to bring it up and talk about it, because you don't really want to be with someone who can't accept you for your flaws.
Welcome to Spark Joy, the podcast dedicated to celebrating the KonMari method and the transformative power of surrounding yourself with joy and letting go of all the rest. With your hosts and certified KonMari consultants, Kristen Ivy and Karen Sochi. And now, here's the show.
Today, we are going to discuss how to spark joy when it comes to your finances and the impact financial clutter has on our relationships, on our mental and our physical health as well. Our guest today is Tess Wicks. I met Tess at Next Door Chicago, which is a co-working space, not to be confused with Next Door, the social network. It's actually a co-working facility for entrepreneurs, those who need a space to go outside of the house and gather. What's great about Nextdoor is they have workshops. So Tess was teaching a workshop on how to create a podcast, the nuts and bolts, the behind the scenes. And just some background, Karen and I, we were big fans of podcasts, but we had no clue all of the behind the scenes layers of work that was required to actually get a podcast on air. So Tess's advice was invaluable, and we have two other podcast mentors that have really helped us get this off the ground. So we're so grateful for them, and they answered all of our questions and helped us get started and on this project that we love and that sparks so much joy. So we're so excited to have one of those podcast mentors with us today, and we're excited to return the favor by having Tess on our show to talk about her passion, which is helping us manage our money. So personally, I'm looking forward to this show because I need that advice. I would say after tidying the KonMari way, I realized that I needed to declutter that slice of the life pie that is finance. So I've been looking very closely at that aspect of my life now that my home is in order and I don't have to concern myself with my space. So Tess is a personal finance coach and educator. She is the founder of Wander Wealthy, an online community for women in their 20s and 30s to get inspired and achieve their personal development, money, and travel goals. Tess creates video content on her Wander Wealthy Facebook page and YouTube channel and is the host of the Words and Money podcast. Tess wants to empower women to get smart about their money while still being able to spend it on things that bring them joy. Welcome to Spark Joy, Tess.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Welcome to the show, Tess.
Thank you.
So Tess, you've had formal training and education in science, finance, literacy. You've also had experience with things like performing improv and teaching kettlebell classes and playing violin, really cool stuff. So we are really fascinated by and want to know more about your story. How do you kind of connect the dots across all those different interests and ultimately land on the area of personal finances and helping women take control of their money?
Well, you really did a deep dive into my background.
Yeah.
I guess that's what happens when you live your life online.
Right.
But
Exactly.
I mean, it kind of makes sense now that you put it out there in front of me. I studied actuarial science in college, which is not actually science. It's actually finance and statistics. It's kind of if finance and statistics had a baby and then that baby was afraid to take risk. So actuaries typically work for insurance companies and consulting companies to help them or other companies reduce their costs with the risky environment of doing business. And I was one of those people. And then I did that for a couple years and I worked really hard to become an actuary, but I decided that it wasn't really right for me. Growing up, I lived my life doing a lot of arts and performance, but I also was obviously very interested in fitness and being active, and it just was hard to kind of sit at a desk and crunch numbers all day. So I got the entrepreneurial bug and left that world behind to kind of do my own thing. And so that led me to creating content online and exploring what opportunities were there. And I knew I wanted to create something where I could help others. And the biggest gap I saw was in the financial industry. Especially me as a how old was I then? 23 or 24 years old. I still had so many questions around my personal finances, even though I had a financial background. And so I knew if I had questions, a ton of my peers must have questions too. I found that a lot of online or even in-person financial services companies didn't really speak to women and their needs. And so I really wanted to fill that gap to educate the women that, were my age, just out of college, really starting their career, and help them see and feel empowered about how they could use their finances. And I get to kind of perform in a way that, I'm not necessarily doing improv anymore, teaching kettlebell classes, but I get to perform and teach on a much bigger stage by doing it online.
That's very cool. And were you always particularly financially savvy, or did that come naturally to you?
I've been always very financially cautious.
Okay.
And my parents are extremely savvy when it comes to finances. So I had a very decent upbringing of kind of making smart decisions with my money. I also, when I was very little, I would just save money. And I still do. I call myself a money hoarder. I tend to just keep money and hide it in various places, online, in the bank, invested, and elsewhere. Not so much cash or under my bed, but I tend to hold on to money and avoid debt as much as possible, which is just something I learned from growing up with my parents.
It's so interesting, I think, that you chose a field in finance that was so risk averse, and yet you're now an entrepreneur. I mean, that is so opposite. But so I'm going to be really interested to hear how that evolution occurred for you.
Yeah, I kind of I like to put myself in really uncomfortable situations to see how I will perform. And so I'm actually this is kind of another example that is not related at all, but another example of how I do this is I'm very introverted. And then I put myself on stage and do improv or teach classes or go online and do podcast interviews or do video, live videos or whatever. And I tend to just know that this is somewhere I kind of identify places where I need to grow or where I need to challenge myself, and I dive into it. So I think that's probably why I decided I should try entrepreneurship.
That's a great lesson too. Like, sometimes it's okay to get a little uncomfortable in order to, just shake things up a little bit or grow.
Right.
I love that. It's something that I try to do myself. It's a little tough sometimes because I too am team introvert, I would say, for sure. But I do enjoy people as well, socializing. But there's always that time that you need to recharge as well when you're an introvert. I'm sure you're familiar with that, Tess.
Yes, and I think it's just we kind of identify points where we need to push ourselves a little bit and see how we can grow. And I will say that I don't tend to take risk without it being pretty calculated or prepared. Mm-hmm. So I was very prepared when I went from full-time to entrepreneurship. And I had some sort of plan, whether it was a good cushion of savings or, being prepared to figure out how I was going to make money. So I try to take calculated risks.
That's awesome. Good cushion of saving. Definitely a good financial tip for sure. So we are all about, simplifying things here at Spark Joy. living a life of more, but with less, intentionally evaluating the things that we keep around us. And that includes practicing the KonMari method. But of course, there's other complementary schools of thought, like minimalism or frugalism. There's even essentialism as well. So considering all of those different ways or tools you can use to kind of live a better life, which one would you say you would gravitate the most to, or how would you characterize your own personal finance philosophy?
Yeah, and it's so funny that you asked this question because I so badly want to be a minimalist. I feel like that's such a sexy term right now. Yeah. But I know that there's certain areas in my life where I just cannot. And so I'm definitely more of an essentialist. I'm not so frugal. I can be frugal in areas as well. So I'm minimalist and a frugalist in certain areas, but it's definitely more, my philosophy is, especially with money, is if it brings you joy, make room in your budget and spend on that thing, or save up for that thing that you really want to splurge on. And then that helps you build awareness, and it kind of keeps you from spending on things that you just, for some reason, we feel like we should be spending money on, but then when we get down to it, we realize, that's not really anything that's necessary or that brings us joy, and we can very well do without. So I think essentialism is the separating the essential few from the trivial many.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Or finding what your essential few are, so that you're not directing your energy or your money towards too many different items. You have a really intentional path forward, and you're not spreading yourself too thin. That's how I would characterize it.
Yeah.
And we can link that book, Essentialism, in the show notes as well, so you guys can have that as a reference. And,
yes, that's one of my favorite books.
Oh, awesome.
I read it when I was working in the corporate world, and I was like, I got to get out of here.
Wow. So
I need to take a nap.
Well, I think that probably ties back in with, as you described yourself, an introverted extrovert, that realizing that, there's just a price that you're paying for all of that, and really just evaluating where you are as far as where you see your life in 5 years or 10 years, which I think is also a big concept when you talk about, growing and preserving your wealth. When we talk about decluttering in KonMari, a lot of times, people who are new to the idea run up against this concept of getting rid of things and whether or not that fits in with living a frugal life. Because, you paid money for these things that you're now donating or giving away or selling or whatever. How do you see living kind of a more thoughtful, mindful life and minimizing possessions fitting in with how you would grow your wealth?
Oh, there's so many great synergies there. I think, what I kind of preach is having your priorities. And this goes kind of back to the essentialism is, prioritizing what those important things are. And what is essential to you, and then everything else is kind of clutter. And so when we pay attention, and again, I'm always talking about prioritizing and building awareness around your spending, or just even the things that you own. And when you start to get rid of things, you start to recognize what you can live off of and what is absolutely unnecessary, and just kind of that clutter. And that builds that awareness, and it builds that muscle of being able to say no in the future. So you can end up spending less, but then you can see it by spending less, you've opened up room in, your income to be able to go towards a different financial vehicle. So it's no longer going to your expenses. It's now going to maybe an investment or a savings account, or somewhere where you can actually put your money to work for you and watch it grow.
Right. I really like what you just said about building muscle. We think a lot in terms of so this red dress that I have hanging in my closet, it was really gorgeous in the store. It looks good in my closet, but it doesn't look good on me. So what is the purpose of this item? Well, it taught me that I don't look good in red. So, and maybe that's all it was meant to do. but then you know in the future that maybe that's not the right color for you. So really, in a way, even though you've invested in a lesson that now will help you financially in the future.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to, I think one of the big issues that we face with money, especially with women being so emotionally attached to their money, is sometimes you feel this guilt from spending it. And it's really good to kind of flip that script and say, you know, this red dress that I never wear, but I'm going to keep in my closet, or, you know, if I decide to get rid of it, whatever it is, it's still, it was an investment to tell yourself, you know, now you have a reason why you bought it. And it's no longer this, oh, I just wasted money buying this red dress.
Right.
Yeah, I like to tell my clients, the money's gone. It's already spent. I say that in the nicest way possible.
We say that's a sunk cost.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So one of the things when it comes to tidying, or one of the main things when it comes to tidying a home with our clients in the KonMari method, is this idea of beginning with a vision for how you see yourself in the future. And for some people, that whole idea is really overwhelming. The concept of like going through all of your items or taking a look at even your financial situation is so overwhelming. A lot of people have a hard time getting started. I mean, I think getting started for a lot of people in all of these areas is really the first big hurdle, or maybe the biggest hurdle to overcome. What would you say are some really good first steps for people to take when they want to begin to get their financial lives in order?
Yes. So I have a couple thoughts on this. And the first one absolutely is just to commit. And whether that's setting a time in your calendar and a reminder to block out an hour of your day to sit down and officially commit to it. And that's when, you know, you sit down and you pull up your bank statements, or you pull up your debt payoff, mechanisms, or if it's an online account, you look it up and you pull all of your numbers together. So I like to, just start with calculating your net worth, which is everything that you own minus everything that you owe. And that just gives you a financial picture. And I also kind of cushion that statement with saying, don't worry about what your net worth is, whether it's positive or negative. There's no benchmark or rule of thumb about where you have to be at any given point in your life. The best part is that you're just doing it. You're sitting down and you're doing it. And then the second thing is, when you, like you said, you look out and it's really hard to, imagine yourself or have that vision because it's so far out into the future and you can't even imagine what that would look like. And I really like to promote setting much shorter term goals. So if someone has a long-term goal of paying off their debt and being debt free, sure, that's a great long-term goal to have. And you should definitely write that down. But then let's think about what you can realistically accomplish in 3 months. And now let's envision what you can, do with that kind of financial freedom that you've freed yourself of in just 3 months. And so, whether it's just saying I'm going to pay X towards my debt instead of, have it all paid off, you can still at least envision what that would be like to have paid a sum of your debt off in 3 months and already feel a little bit of weight lifted off your shoulders. So I find that breaking things down into shorter chunks is really helpful when it's so hard to envision so far out with such a, I've never been debt free. So how am I, how could I even imagine myself like that? It's easier to just think, okay, what about if you just had 10% less debt, and just getting the ball rolling there.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's interesting how many parallels there is between tackling finances in the way that you just described and how to tidy the home. I know I tell my clients or I kind of compare KonMari to intense debt programs or debt repayment programs or like a diet program where it's intentionally you're confronting things intentionally in order to kind of change behaviors, I guess. So with KonMari, you tidy all at once and not like a little bit here, a little bit there. But the first step is just like you said, making the time to making it a priority, and then setting up the vision. I know when I started working through tidying, I realized that I had like the clutter was just a symptom of something that was deeper, and it ended up being my discomfort with just my ability to produce something in my career that really matters and makes a difference. So the remedy was shopping. And I realized that when I was going through the clothing process, and that was totally not working for me. So after after completing tidying, I decided to look deeper into finances, and I have a vision of where I want to be. But I was wondering if you could help me and others who might have the vision but really don't know what the next step would be. Like, what would you suggest as like some key tips to kind of decluttering once you know where you want to be financially?
Yeah, so there's several different ways you can go from this. But definitely, after taking that first step of sitting down and, just seeing what's out there, what debt do you have? What income do you have coming in? How much cash do you have in the bank? Do you have any investments? Seeing where you're at and what your net worth is, then you can kind of take an organized approach to managing your finances. And so step one is to, sit down and set your goals and decide where you want to be at in 3 months. And then determine, what are your financial goals? Are they short term? Which is under a year? And that'll also help you identify what sort of financial vehicle you should be putting your money into. Are they medium term, which is anywhere from over 1 year to 7 to 10 years out? So that could be planning for kids one day, and so you want to start saving now because kids are expensive. Or maybe you want to buy a home or buy a new car. And then long-term goals would be things like retirement or investing for a second home or investing for a kid's college fund. And so kind of defining where your financial goals are. And really, you can get really deep with this, and you don't have to have any sort of actual plan on every single one of them because that'll come with time. But getting it all out of your head is a good way to start, and then categorizing them from short term to medium term to long term. And then what I do is I really start with the short term, and I have a way of organizing my finances actually by having multiple bank accounts. And that feels a little bit disorganized because, you're going from one bank account to many, but it actually helps give your money a purpose. And when you're saving for the short term, or you're trying to pre-save for some big expenses or some expensive times of year, like the holidays, I find that it's really helpful to, after you get your income in your regular checking account, then automatically sending some money to these various categorized bank accounts that will help you save for those big goals that you have to achieve for yourself throughout the year. So a couple that I recommend are emergency savings, of course, having that account as a buffer for in case of any emergencies. And then also I like to recommend weddings and gifts. And this is other people's weddings that we often tend to have a lot of when we're in our 20s and 30s, and even beyond. And gifts, of course, is for holiday times as well as birthdays throughout the year, but having an account set aside so that you're actively saving for those expensive times of year. And then I also personally have a stupid mistakes account because I make a lot of stupid mistakes, like living in Chicago and getting parking tickets quite frequently. But that's a way that I like to organize my finances and, it's kind of like having a place in your home for everything. Like everything has its place. It's not disorganized and, spilling over into something else. You know exactly what that money is meant for. And it really helps you avoid getting into any sort of consumer debt because you're pre-saving for a lot of these big things.
I see. And when it comes to day-to-day bills, do you connect that to one of the accounts and then go from there, or how does that work?
Yeah. So I actually recommend, so those would all be savings accounts, the goals-based accounts. Then for your spending, of course, you have the money that your paycheck gets deposited into the account for that. And then you would separate that account. So that account could remain as is as your fixed expenses account. And then you could have your discretionary spending account. And so fixed expenses are those things that you can predict from month to month. And they're typically your necessary living expenses. So it's things like rent or your mortgage, any type of insurance payments, utility bills, cell phone, internet, all of that. And then, if you have like your Netflix being drawn out of that account, it's a fixed expense. So keep it in that account, even though it might be discretionary in quotes. It's like not enough money to throw you off.
Unless sparks joy. So
unless that's something that doesn't spark joy, and then you absolutely can get rid of it.
Exactly.
But then the discretionary account is where everything fluctuates. Some weeks or months you go out to dinner a lot, and some you stay in and you make your food at home. Sometimes you drive around a lot. You need to fill your car up with gas, and sometimes you don't. Especially if you're in Chicago, if you have a car, it can, vary wildly, like it does for me. And then that's also for entertainment and shopping and events and all of the things that you don't need to necessarily live on as far as your baseline living goes, but it's all those things that you make kind of last minute decisions to pull out your credit card and swipe.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned cars. That was one of my post-tidying, I guess you could say discard or donate. I don't know. But I let go of my vehicle. I've had a vehicle since 2000. And so I was a little nervous, but I found that once I moved to Chicago, I just really haven't needed it. So now I'm just really careful about not going crazy with Uber, because that's
right. Uber
very easy to do. So that's my new, I guess, discretionary or / necessary spending category. But I love that idea of splitting everything up so you don't find yourself panicking when those unexpected kind of situations come up. It's a great tip. So I know for me, this is the case. I don't know if it's for everyone, but I feel like there's still a bit of fear, shame, embarrassment sometimes associated around money. There's a great deal of more transparency, I feel, around just talking about money now that we have this, great equalizer that is social media, and these great programs that have come out around finances, whether it be Susie Orman or Dave Ramsey, just people who are just really talking about money and standing in your truth very, not as intimidating or kind of breaking the barriers there. But I feel like still there's some, issues, especially when it comes to women talking about their money, even to their close friends and family. Where do you think that stems from, and how can we kind of move beyond that way of thinking?
Yeah. So talking about money, it's just always been kind of taboo, and some of it is income related. We've kind of been trained not to talk about our income, how much money you make, whether that's employers that kind of mandate that, or that is just because people are embarrassed if they don't make as much as their peers. And then also debt related, especially in more recent years, a lot of people have graduating with much more student loan debt. And then that can kind of feed into also the consumer debt. And it's because, okay, well, what's so wonderful right now about this whole minimalist movement is that I feel like it's kind of the first step towards showing people that less really is more, and that we don't need to be spending so much. So I'm very excited about that. Because I believe in the past that we've been in such a highly consumerist culture, and that would mean that, if you don't have the things that other people has, the family across the street or next door, then you're not in the same class level. And there's some sort of fear around that has to be happening. And now we're kind of moving away from that, just because it's almost having less things is the new sexy. And so there's a lot more pride to be had. But the shame and the fear and the embarrassment is definitely still there, just because it's such a taboo topic. And it's kind of rooted into our nature as human beings to not be comfortable talking about it. Becoming comfortable about talking about it is really important. So we can kind of build the knowledge, the knowledge base of where we should be at, without getting into the comparison game. And that's really hard. That's a really hard line to walk. But just having more conversations without, having to divulge your numbers, but explaining, especially if you're in a peer group, that it's where your priorities lie. That can be a really easy way to ease into, or run along the same path of having the money conversation, because maybe you don't want to spend as much money on XYZ things that your friends want to spend money on. Sure. But of course, then there's, when it comes to having the conversation with your partner, that is very, very, very important. That doesn't mean you have to combine your finances. You can kind of choose and do what you want with that, but you need to understand where your partner is financially, so you can, make sure that if you're blending your lives together, that you can, watch out for each other and grow together.
It's awesome.
Yeah, because I think it gets really complicated when it's certainly complicated just when it comes to your friends, as far as deciding, what you can invest in doing various activities. But when you're talking about, a committed relationship and how both of your visions for your future fit together or don't fit together. And I'm a big believer in the idea that people who are very different can be very happy together. But there's definitely conversations that have to happen, and, getting expectations and kind of belief systems out on the table, I think is really important. But it's so hard. I mean, it's such a hard conversation to have. Mm-hmm. It's so different. It's so the opposite of what, the romance part of a relationship, but it can really make a huge difference on down the road.
Yeah, it's kind of inevitable that it's going to come up eventually, and it's much better to bring it up now. And, I'm speaking specifically, I've seen a lot of, especially women who carry around consumer debt that their partners don't know about. And their goal is to just pay it off and kind of brush it under the rug and pretend like it never happened. And my only kind of pause to that is, I have a couple, and one is you want to make sure if you can have the conversation before any sort of commitment takes place, then that helps you understand if your partner is willing to kind of work through this with you and support you and be your cheerleader. And, you can take all the responsibility for it. You can show them, I'm fessing up to you because I want to take responsibility for this debt and I want to pay it off and I want to do it wisely. But I also need your support because a lot of times it's in our relationships where one person is a spender and one person is a saver, or one person, or they're both spenders and one person is trying to get out of a lot of credit card debt but can't because they're kind of held up to this expectation. So it's really highly recommended to kind of make sure you're on the same playing field before getting into that commitment and then being afraid to kind of divulge these secrets that you might have.
Right. Just the anxiety alone of carrying around that kind of, kind of secret financial issue, I think is really, it's so damaging. Mm-hmm. Just on a personal level. I know certainly in times of my life when I've had, those types of issues that I just wanted to take care of myself. And I just hoped that everything would go just exactly the way it needed to go so that I could deal with this. But it's the anxiety that you carry around and during those, with those kinds of issues, I think is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And probably unnecessary,
Right.
Yeah. It almost feels like a weight or just a cloud or something that's just always there and just always know that it's just all on your mind. I mean, I can imagine it has also just a effect on physical being as well. I know for me, I'm very sensitive to stressful situations and anxiety, and the if I'm thinking about it, then sometimes it definitely impact how I'm physically am acting day to day as well.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to, no matter how much anxiety it might produce in the moment, to bring it up and talk about it, because you don't really want to be with someone who can't accept you for your flaws. And if you can kind of bring that to the forefront, then they can help you. And that doesn't necessarily mean financially, but from a supportive standpoint, from if you are trying to make up then other excuses for why you don't want to purchase something or go to or take this trip or travel because you have a goal that they don't know about, it just feels very damaging.
Sure. And I think those lines of communication are also important when considering tidying as well. That tidying is one thing that also brings up a lot of emotions or feelings, or kind of sparks conversations that may not happen if you don't put the attention on organizing the home. I know that's happened just even between me and my parents when we've talked about like things that they enjoy, things they don't, things that spark joy for them, things that don't. I've just learned a lot more about them, and I was very afraid to talk to them about something that I wanted to donate that had been passed down from a family. And then when I actually got the courage to call my dad about it, he was like, you know what? I really just appreciate the fact that you even asked, before and I'm not mad at all. And, I also need to evaluate whether or not we need to keep all of these objects in our home it was actually my great grandmother's ceramic pieces. And it kind of opened his eyes, and he was just appreciative that I even asked before I donated it. So it's something that we kind of get scared to talk about, tidying or financing. I think in the end, you're so right when it has to happen. It's so important.
Yes. And to your point, I mean, they run on parallel tracks, because if someone were to go to their partner and mention these financial goals, and that's one way to really start off without kind of digging into the financial skeletons you have in your closet, is let's just start with talking about our goals and where we want to be, and start with an easy conversation. I'd really love to do this in the short term and this in the long term and maybe this in a couple of years. And then maybe the conversation will turn into, okay, how do we get there?
Right.
And what is holding you back? And then you can talk about what's holding you back. And that might even, trigger your partner to say, hey, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're wanting to conquer this goal of paying off debt. I have consumer debt too. Let's pay it off together. There's a lot of ways to kind of, maybe establish goals together or get them inspired to start organizing or improving their financial future.
Yeah, this is so interesting, because one of the guidelines in KonMari is that it's never a good idea to organize someone else's things. So even though you may be really tempted to organize a family member's things, it's really much more important to let them come to that conclusion themselves. So this idea that in KonMari, if you get your own house in order, that other people will be inspired to do that as well. So, but it's still the ownership of the issue that is so important, and recognizing that people need to come to their own place in their own way. And again, it's all about communication and making sure that it's clear the directions that you're both going. I mean, individually and as a couple.
Yes.
So one thing I wanted to talk about is your podcast, Words and Money. You've featured some career women who are financially independent and growing their own wealth. When you think about the guests that you've had on your show, there's a really strong common link. And there's a lot of things that they've done to bring them to the decision to become more financially independent. What do you think the collective secret is for women who have really achieved their financial independence?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can reveal their secrets.
We want to know all the secrets.
It's a
things.
secret. Wow.
It's a very public secret. And it really is just anyone can achieve financial independence. The hardest part is taking action. So that's probably their secret, is that they take action, they implement. So when they learn new things or learn of new opportunities or find ways to make more money, they actually take action and they implement. And then the other thing is that they put their money to work for them. So a lot of that kind of goes into investing or creating businesses that really kind of produce great returns on the investment that they had to make to create their business. Or maybe that is buying a home that they then, investing in a home that turns into a rental property and it produces income. And a lot of this is, you put your money to work for you. And so you're making passive income because you don't have to actively be, working in order to make that money. You make an upfront investment and then it continues to pay dividends. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy by any means, but that means that they're educating themselves and they're taking action consistently.
So it's really kind of moving toward a place where you can begin to invest into vehicles that provide a passive income as well as an active income. I think we've that's something that you always hear, but it sounds so unobtainable for the average person. But I think it's, as you've talked about throughout, it's really making those first steps and taking the action to getting there.
And honestly, it sounds unattainable, but it's very, very quite easy. And without getting too far into kind of the world of investing, it's very easy to open up a brokerage account through a robo-advisor online, and you can just put $100. Just find $100 that you don't care if it disappears someday, which that might be hard because I know we all hold tight to our money. We don't want to lose it. But if you're willing to take a small amount of risk and just see if you can put $100 to work for you, I think you'll recognize how easy it actually is to put your money away. And then from there, you get a little bit more comfortable with kind of putting your money into other various vehicles that will prove to give you a return.
So we're very interested to know if you have made a splurge purchase recently that sparked joy for you.
Oh, I make splurge purchases all the time. I pre-save for my splurges, but I definitely treat myself. The most recent one, and this is, if you watch any of my videos, I think one of them I talked about, there's 5 things that I will not give up, even though I kind of live this more essential approach to spending money. And that is, I get to go to wine country for a wedding for one of my dear friends. And I decided to buy myself a massage while I'm there. So massages are my favorite way to pamper myself, and they definitely spark joy.
Great.
Awesome. And building on that, when you think about just your life in general, what's sparking the most joy right now at this very moment? We ask all of our guests to share your biggest spark joy moment right now in your life.
I think it's, I know it's that I'm finally really living and breathing what my brand is. And my brand, Wander Wealthy, is educating women to become empowered and fearless about, finding their freedom, and taking adventures and enjoying things in their life, while they live within their financial means. And I get to do that, because I am finally officially location independent. I'm going to be in Italy for 2 months this summer. Living and working, and I get to educate. And I apologize, this is typical Chicago, there's a fire truck passing, but I'll talk through it. All right. I get to educate women just like myself and help them kind of figure out the different ways that they can do what I do.
Beautiful. And do you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners?
I would say The biggest piece of advice that I can leave is to take that first step. And that's just to commit and take action for 1 hour where you sit down and you decide that you're committed to decluttering your financial life.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so important. And thank you so much for being on our show. I want to let all of our listeners know that Tess Wicks is offering a free anti-budget training.
Yes.
And I'm so excited
Do you want
about
me to
this.
explain it real quick? I know it
I
sounds
do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the anti-budget is a really, really simplistic form of budgeting. And it all boils down to one number that you get each day to spend. And I explain it in the free training. I won't take up any more time, but it's completely, I've always hated and been really, really terrible at budgeting, and it's completely changed the way that I spend. It helps me build awareness around my spending, which is one of the things that we talked about. I'm sure with the KonMari method, you also need to build a lot of awareness around things you collect. This is building awareness around things that you're spending money on. And it also helps me stay within, living within my means and making sure that I'm not overspending. And then that would directly be linked to that discretionary bank account that we talked about earlier with the different savings and checking accounts. So the anti-budget is a daily number that is completely simplifying budgeting as you know it.
That sounds amazing. I'll definitely be checking that out. And I want our listeners to know that you can find the free anti-budget training at www.wanderwealthy.com/anti-budget.
Yes.
All right. So thank you so much, Tess, for joining us here at Spark Joy. It was so great having you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.
Thank you so much for joining. It was really great to have you on. So you can connect with Tess Wicks at wanderwealthy.com, join the Wander Wealthy community on Facebook and YouTube, and check out Tess's podcast, Words and Money.
So now we want to hear from you. Tell us your burning tidying questions or share stories about how KonMari has impacted your life.
You can find us at sparkjoypodcast.com and click Ask Spark Joy to leave a question or comment for a chance to be featured on next week's show. You can also join the discussion on Facebook or on Twitter at Spark Joy Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in, and we hope your day sparks joy.
Thank you for listening to Spark Joy with your host, Kristen Ivy of For the Love of Tidy in Chicago and Karen Sochi of the Serene Home in New York City. Spark Joy, the podcast, is not endorsed by or affiliated with KonMari Media Incorporated. The opinions expressed on this episode represent the views of the co-hosts and guests alone and do not represent the corporate position of KonMari Media Incorporated or the KonMari consultant community.